we're consulting way too often. You're looking at 3, 4, 5 consultations for some infrastructure projects. Nothing is going to be said in the 5th consultation that wasn't said in the 1st consultation. Plus, because everything is online, cost of actually voicing your opinion is so much lower. So people with not really that much skin in the game can, try and derail things by posting their objections. So all of these problems need to be fixed.
There is mounting speculation this week that the government intends to abandon the Birmingham to Manchester link of HS2 over skyrocketing costs. The link, which is meant to reach from London to Manchester via Birmingham, could now, by some estimates, cost well over £100 billion. This is, though, the latest in a long string of eye-wateringly expensive UK infrastructure. Welcome to the IEA Podcast. My name is Lesh, and I'm the Director of Public Policy and Communications here at the IEA. Each week, this podcast asks a tantalizing policy question. Today's question: why is Britain's infrastructure so expensive? To discuss, I'm very excited to be joined by Sam Dumitriu, who's the Head of Policy at Britain Remade, who are a campaign group. Before joining Britain Remade, he worked at a range of Westminster think tanks, including the Adam Smith Institute and the Entrepreneurs Network, covering topics including immigration, technology, and education. He also writes an excellent Substack called Notes on Growth. Welcome to the podcast, Sam.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start with this week's big story, which is about HS2. What's going on here? Why is HS2 so insanely expensive?
So there are two stories here, right? So first of all, there is the cost overrun story. So when HS2 was first proposed, the costing was put at something like about £56 billion to go from London, Birmingham, Manchester, and Leeds all together. That's if you adjust it for inflation today. The problem is inflation's gone along up and down a bit, has gone up quite a bit since then. So I'm going to try and, where possible, talk in 2023 prices. So it should have cost what it's costing today, just to do the London and Birmingham leg. So there's been a massive increase in costs that can't be explained just by inflation alone. But if you just look at the initial project, the initial distance that it was going to cover, it would have cost about £165 million per mile. Now that would still be more than double the cost Italy paid to build a high-speed connection between Naples and Bari, about 3.7 times what it costs France to build a link between Tours and Bordeaux, and significantly more too than what Japan built a bullet train line for. They can build one at a cost of about £50 million per mile. So that suggests that it's not purely something that's happened in the last 10 years. There is a deeper problem, and that's why what we've been doing as an organization is looking at the relative cost, the absolute cost of infrastructure across the world. People previously have focused on cost overruns, the tendency for almost any major infrastructure project to quote a budget, and then it turns out, they're 40%, 50%, maybe 200% over cost what they initially quoted. That's important to figure out, why these cost overruns happen. But we also need to think deeply about why we are in a situation where even if we stick to the budget, even if we came in under budget and over delivered, we would still be getting bad value for money.
Well, I think this is the interesting point here. So a lot of people, I suppose, on the free market or centre-right side of this debate have been quite critical of HS2 on the basis that the cost benefit doesn't really add up. They're spending a huge amount of money, even if it was 50 billion, wouldn't necessarily add up, and certainly doesn't add up to 100 billion worth of value. I wonder whether you're kind of, I suppose, sympathetic that we shouldn't really be trying to do these massive infrastructure projects if they're going to cost so much, and the government should have cancelled HS2 long ago, and cancelling the second leg makes perfect sense now. Or is this just a matter of figuring out how to do these things more cheaply? Because I don't think people on the free market side would care that much about putting this train line if it, let's say, cost 10 billion, and there were, clearly the cost benefit ratio then would be very different as opposed to 100 billion.
Yeah, I suspect most of the opposition to projects like HS2 from a fiscal perspective, not from a, my bit of farmland or my house is being demolished to make way for this line sort of perspective, but from a purely fiscal perspective, I doubt it would be an issue if we were building at French costs. We might be instead debating HS4 or 5 if we were building at French or Italian costs. And you do look around Europe, countries that are similar size to us seem to be able to build a lot more high-speed lines. Now, from my perspective, the priority should always be that commuter rail. I think agglomeration within cities is ultimately the transport projects that deliver the most growth. Now, HS2 did have a case on that front in that it would free up a bit of space on those commuter lines. But fundamentally, if we can bring costs down, some of these debates that we're currently having over whether HS2 is the right or the wrong project, the balance of the balance of the decision would be completely different. And I think it's really important to figure out how these costs increase quite dramatically. Maybe we could talk about how HS2 and the sort of power of NIMBYs and how that has pushed up costs for HS2.
Well, indeed, I think just on that first point, quickly, on the marginal pound spend, it does seem quite obviously that HS2 is not a particularly wise project, that there's a bit of a political tendency towards the kind of long distance rail over kind of quieter commuter rail projects that might be less expensive and less showy, but more economically beneficial. So improving commuter rail into London, for example, or into Manchester and Leeds for that matter, could probably have more of an effect. Let's unpack that though, because we haven't really got into why HS2 is so expensive, and we've established it is insanely expensive. I think that the first reason you've already flagged there is the impact of nimbyism. How does that push up the cost of HS2? And is there a broader story here about it pushing up the cost of all sorts of different infrastructure projects?
So the other day I was reading the Times, and there was a stat about HS2 that blew my mind. So on a 45-minute journey from London to Birmingham, that's via Old Oak Common, I believe, only 7 minutes you'd actually get sunlight. The rest of the journey would either be tunneled, so we have about 25% of the route is tunneled, and then the rest of it is in either a cutting or a noise wall. So, it's not going to be, I quite like looking out the window when I go when I'm on the train and seeing sort of nice countryside. But most of what you'd see on HS2 route would be just a wall or maybe like trees basically to block you off from wider view and to keep the noise impact down. Now that all adds costs. So there's a study in the US looking at the interstate highway system. This is by two economists, Brooks and Lisco. What they looked at was why costs increased in the US interstate highway system over the past between 1960 and 1980, because that seems to be where the costs really jumped up, and then we sort of stayed at that high baseline and gone up quite a bit since then, but that's where the big jump happens. And what they found was that coincided with a period where citizens gained a lot more power to object to infrastructure projects. And what happens with those objections is there's lots of different ways sort of NIMBYism can affect costs. So, you've got to prepare the environmental impact assessments and the planning application. £267 million is what it cost the Lower Thames Crossing to prepare its planning application. I say that's what it cost. That's what it cost so far, because it's still not done yet. So that on its own is a significant cost. Then you have the time lost. We know that inflation in construction seems to run high. We know that when you have a delay, it makes it harder to maintain that consistent workforce, so you don't get that long-term experience in the role, and it's much harder to train people if they don't know when they're actually going to go into that job. So you either have to pay them more to incentivize them. So that pushes up costs. But the thing that they really found was that NIMBYism, the sort of ability of citizens to object, led to project design changes. So things like the additional tunnelling for HS2, things like cuttings, things like these noise walls, and they sort of found that, and this is I think the exact term is tortuosity, but they used a much more accessible term of wiggliness. And they found that there was an increase in the wiggliness of roads over time because basically engineers were engineering round a political problem fundamentally. And they calculate that a 0.01 mile per year in the increase in the wiggliness of a road is associated with about a 9.7 million pounds in increase in cost per mile. And you see these alterations on HS2 adding cost. So that's definitely going to be a factor. Yeah, I would say this isn't the only factor, purely because the fact is we know that the bullet train line I mentioned that Japan built, that has more tunneling than HS2. So it's not just this, but almost certainly this does add additional costs. The debate Parliament had to put HS2 through, amendments and sort of negotiations led to an additional amount of tunnelling under the Chilterns. Probably we're counting the cost of that parliamentary debate at about £1 billion to £2 billion in increased costs. That's
there's
impressive.
this kind of interesting historical story here as well, isn't it? That the reason why citizens' objections have been taken more seriously in I suppose the last 30, 40 years is because there was this kind of post-war period, I suppose, particularly in the US, most famously around Robert Moses in New York, where he very much steamrolled through local opposition in quite a pernicious way in terms of he got rid of the slums, but he built huge tower blocks and massive highways all the way through New York. I don't think Robert Moses was unique. I think it happened in a lot of American cities and probably happened at least to some extent, maybe not the same extent in the UK. Perhaps the most famous example here is the Euston Station, which we know these days is an ugly monstrosity, but used to be quite a beautiful classical piece of architecture. Is there that kind of enabler as a response to that kind of post-war trend towards demolition and top-down, almost kind of progressive in a post-war way to build all these things out? And then the response to that, the political economy response to that, has been too far in the other direction, which is to give too much power to local objection.
I think that's right. And we in Britain didn't quite do the Robert Moses thing in London. We did it in some places, Birmingham in particular. Just you go through the city centre of Birmingham. There's essentially a motorway in the middle. It's a really bad use of land. But in London, there were proposals that would have destroyed many of London's most beloved neighbourhoods. You'd have had motorways going through Camden. Maybe it would cut down journey times, but it would also destroy a heck of a lot of value. And it's very good that people were able to push back against this. But as you said, it seems like the pendulum swung way too far the other way. Now it's too easy to object to these projects. And you have these long drawn out planning processes. You have design changes that push up costs. And ultimately, a lot of the time you see these infrastructure projects, people object all the way. And then when it's finally built, they actually use it and they say, oh, well, actually, yeah, it's quite convenient, or it wasn't as bad as we thought. Meanwhile, when they do make these design changes, there's a lot of what's called green tunneling. So this isn't tunneling necessarily to get around the terrain of Britain, but this is to reduce the visual impact on land. So they're digging up a bit of land, cutting it open, building some tracks underneath, then filling it up on the top. This isn't the sort of high-tech tunnel boring machine kind of stuff. And what's on the top will be green, and you can walk over it and it will be nice. Perfectly pleasant, but that adds costs. It's not very green because you have to use a heck of a lot of concrete. And ultimately, will the locals really see the benefit, or are they really upset about the disruption to their lives in the short term rather than the actual loss of a view? Or they might see a train every 15 minutes. Not the end of the world in my view. So I think that is a real issue, and we've got to definitely find ways of bringing communities along, but we clearly have gone too far. We're consulting way too often. You're looking at 3, 4, 5 consultations for some infrastructure projects. Nothing is going to be said in the 5th consultation that wasn't said in the 1st consultation. And plus, because everything is online, the cost of actually voicing your opinion is so much lower. So people with not really that much skin in the game can, try and derail things by posting their objections. So all of these problems need to be fixed.
Derailing being, of course, the appropriate metaphor in this particular case. Although I do note that your kind of excellent the database you put together with 200 projects is not just about rail. It's also about tram lines and motorway bridges and road lanes and road tunnels and rail electrification, all of which the UK seems to be particularly expensive in putting together. So we'll kind of address the NIMBY issue there. Another issue which I see you've kind of unpacked quite fascinatingly is, I suppose, more kind of interrelated, but is a slightly different one, which is kind of like a green red tape issue, the extent to which the environmental assessments, as well as, I suppose, interrelated, the environmental judicial objections become such a major cost in any kind of infrastructure project you want to put together. I was particularly struck by your example of the Jubilee Line extension, whose impact assessment for environmental purposes was something like 400 pages, as opposed to Sizewell C, whereas 44,000 pages, which seems totally insane, and is still, of course, facing legal objections on environmental grounds.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems here, so we've seen a massive increase in what's expected to be provided, and part of this is driven by what you'd say legal uncertainty. So businesses who want to build new infrastructure, or the government in many cases, who actually, usually in a lot of cases it's the government persuading another bit of the government for permission to build. Now that's fine. That's a separation of powers, the rule of law, and all of that works. That's not a problem. But you look at it and you start to see that it's not very clear that these people know actually what they might get picked up on. So they cover every single possible base, because a legal challenge and the delays from that can really, really slow a project down. So you start to see 7,000 page environmental impact assessments grow to 10,000 pages to 13,000. Now, nuclear power stations, they're very big projects, involve a lot of building, a lot of impact, not just on the actual site itself, but in terms of traffic and the local economy. And they're typically, because they're next to old nuclear power stations, and old nuclear power stations have exclusion zones around them where there's not much building. They tend to also be near sites of special scientific interest and outstanding natural beauty and the like. So this is another thing that they have to contend with. But yeah, there's been a massive growth. Hinkley Point C, 30,000 pages, Sizewell C, 44,000. So that's just a growth on very, very similar projects in the space of like 5, 6, 7 years. So all of these things are an issue, and I think there is an important point to be made here about what actually is green, because if you're building a nuclear power station, it's probably going to reduce the amount of gas you're burning for electricity. So you're going from a high carbon source emitting source of energy to a lower carbon source emitting energy. The same with offshore wind, the same with solar. So these are actually having an impact on the environment, and the same is true with rail projects, right? Now we know for a fact if you're going by rail rather than by car, you're emitting much less, and the worse rail links you have, the higher emissions are going to be. So again, you might block this project trying to help the environment, but there is an environmental cost there too. In terms of roads, there's an interesting debate too, because I think too often, and you might have seen this with the nutrient neutrality debate. I don't know if you've been talking about that recently, but
indeed, yeah.
What essentially people try to place all the environmental burdens of what are real environmental problems, whether it's climate change, loss of biodiversity, the health of our rivers, but place it purely on the most recent contributor and not on all the other contributors, right? So if you're a farm and you're dumping loads of slurry into rivers, and your runoffs are causing really bad environmental impacts, you're not actually really expected to change that much. The government's plan was to basically pay you money so that you would not have those impacts. But if you're a developer, all of that burden is on rectifying your every single bit of making the problem worse. You have to come up with a way of, overcoming it. And in some cases, you're expected to do things that are quite expensive because maybe you don't have that space on the site, or you might, the easy stuff, which is probably going to be related to farming, better farming management, isn't really available to you, or at least it wasn't immediately. And that's the same with lots of things. And roads is a really good example. So we've seen a few road projects taken to court on climate change grounds. The argument is that if you build a road, more people will drive on it. When more people drive, that pushes emissions up. Is that consistent with our objective of reducing emissions? Now, the reality is the number of emissions that are coming from as a result of increased traffic demand and from the construction process for new roads, very, very small fraction of transport emissions. The way you reduce emissions from transport is by switching to cleaner forms of transport, either by making rail more attractive, or more likely, moving from internal combustion engine to EVs. And you've seen that's been in the news a lot, but that's a change that's coming down the way. And when you're looking at these new roads, actually what we found was they have very small contributions, in part because it's, even under quite conservative assumptions, the number of EVs on the road is going to increase a lot, and that's going to massively reduce the carbon impact of driving.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting enough on the neutrality point. There's already mandates on water companies to basically stop putting the existing kind of toxins they're putting into rivers by 2030 anyway. So the only period at which a new development could be making any contribution is between now and 2030, and even then, as you've said, it pales in comparison compared to the cost of so the environmental cost of agriculture and the existing homes. I mean, it's kind of a similar story, I guess, with housing and new development, to this idea of embodied carbon, that we shouldn't demolish buildings and build new ones because there's a negative environmental impact from those new ones, and we should just leave things in place. But of course, on net, if you're building more densely and you're reducing people's individual carbon footprints as well as generally kind of, I suppose, improving the environmental rating of the housing people are living in, then on net, you would think there'd be a positive environmental impact overall. There's some other issues as well that you've been looking at. So you've got the kind of general NIMBY issue that you've discussed, the kind of political barriers. You've got the kind of environmental regulation, the way in which there's not kind of proper cost-benefit analysis here when considering environmental costs. You've also been thinking about things like project management, and as well as, I suppose, the political kind of stop-start process, and kind of more, I suppose, institutional or maybe practical or state capacity failures that might be behind it.
Yeah, so maybe we should start in the sort of stop-start point. That's a confusing collection of words, isn't it? Start and stop-start. Essentially, we use the example of rail electrification for this. So if you look over the past 4 decades or so, Britain has some years built more than 500 kilometres, has electrified 500 kilometres of road. Some years it's not done any. There was a period for about 10 years under Labour where it looked like we probably were going to do something like hydrogen trains, and so there was a sort of pause on rail electrification. So there's been a really inconsistent process. Some years load, some years none, and it's gone up and down and up and down and up and down. Contrast us with a lower cost electrifier in the case of Germany. For the past 4 decades, 200 kilometres, give or take 10 kilometres every year. And why does that matter? So it matters for a few. First, skills. So if you want to train to do something that's specialised like rail electrification, you need to know that there's a job for you to go into. If you don't have that guaranteed job, you won't train, and companies won't invest in training people. So immediately you have a worse skills base. You have to pay people more, either bringing people from overseas who've worked on other rail projects, or paying a lot more so that they can, so it's worth their while actually having that training. So that's a problem in the first place. You also lose out on the experience. So training is one thing, but the best training is on the job. it's those like bits of tacit knowledge that you pick up as you go. You know, electrifying railways in Britain poses lots of unique challenges. We have very, very old railways, older than what the continent will be dealing with. And that means that sometimes you're going through tunnels that were made that are a little bit too small. You're sometimes going through, you know, things that are listed and, you know, special landmarks, and that all adds costs, and that adds like real design challenges. If you've been working on British Rail for a while and electrifying it, you'll probably come up with lots of specific solutions. You might find out that the best way of electrifying railways in Britain is to electrify 90% of what you're trying to electrify, then avoiding the really, really tricky bits or something like that. I think that's kind of what's currently happening in some rail projects. But when you've not done it in ages, you get situations like the Great Western Railway electrification project, where we were meant to go from London to Swansea, but we stopped in Cardiff because of budget, and we were already 3 times over budget. You know, people don't know what they're doing. They don't know how to deal with these specific problems, and costs grow. Now, after that, if people went on to the next job, I'm sure they'd do things better because they'd have that experience, they'd have those mistakes that they can learn from. But the problem is, if you don't have that, mistakes get made again and again and again. They don't get learned from. So that's another reason why stop-start is a problem. But then there's a third reason, which I talk about as industrial structure. So you look at the UK's largest construction company, Balfour Beatty. Internationally, it's quite a small company, much smaller than its sort of Spanish or German counterparts. And part of the issue is, if you look at how contracts are done on major infrastructure projects in the UK, instead of what you might see on the continent, where one construction company does most of the stuff in-house, British construction tends to have a lot of subcontracting. Now, subcontracting immediately creates additional costs. It can be useful because you can manage risk that way. And that's why it's done, because, you know, the risk of, you know, all of a sudden you have hundreds of employees who are ready to build, but there are no projects for them to build, and you're going to have to lay people off, or you're going to have to post a big loss. You know, that's why it's so much reliance on subcontracting. But that is a less inefficient industrial structure. A better approach would be, rather than if we were, you know, picking these projects and coming up with these like big programs that happen or don't happen, we just said that, right, inflation adjusted, we want to spend 200-300 million pounds per year on rail electrification every year for the next 25 years. Industry would know from that there's going to be a lot of demand. And then we would probably come up with ways of doing it cheaper, because we wouldn't have these years where we do nothing. You know, maybe some years we have projects that aren't as pressing as other projects, but, you know, at the whole time, we're never like losing that industrial capacity. We're never losing that knowledge, and that stability would be really important.
So Sam, you've already just given one idea there, but I'm kind of interested. A lot of your analysis so far has very much focused on the relative problems the UK faces, although similarly in a lot of other the other kind of English-speaking countries, the US, Canada, Australia, all have pretty similar substantial infrastructure costs compared to continental countries. What can we do about it? What are the solutions to the kind of problems you've identified in terms of particularly things like nimbyism and the environmental assessment process? You've already given us kind of one response there in terms of how to build up kind of infrastructure and skills and build, I suppose, a domestic industry that has the capacity to deliver these things a bit better. But in terms of some of those other kind of knotty issues, what do you think the solutions are to enable infrastructure costs to come down?
So semi-related, we put out a report earlier this year called Power Book, which looked at how to fix the planning system for the delivery of major energy projects, so that Britain could be energy secure as soon as possible. And a lot of those recommendations, which sort of come down to, you know, moving to a better system of environmental assessment, where they're essentially, developers know the outcomes they're being tested against, and they know the kind of information they need to provide, so they can provide a 200-page document rather than a 1,000-page document. creating a much clearer bit of guidance on what is needed from consultation. At the moment, there's been a gradual increase in the extent to which people are consulted on every project, and there's no real person saying, hang on a minute, this is about proportionality. Yes, it's valuable for people to have their say, but there's also a cost to another 6 months delay. There's a cost to everyone chipping in and adding to the cost of the design of a project. So there needs to be balance there too. We've for some of these projects, it would be good if the government could do sort of strategic environmental assessments. So rather than looking at a project by project thing, there'd be a much wider bit of much more in-depth information for some of these major transport programs. So the individual project doesn't have to go through this process again and again and again. Kind of like the zoning reforms that the government was talking about for housing that got ultimately ditched. But I think the idea of just creating a legal certainty and telling people, this is where you can build. And then another important thing is what's called national policy statements. So these are documents that guide our planning system on major infrastructure projects. So before 2008, we actually had a worse planning system for infrastructure. It was very much involving lots and lots of different councils, all of whom would have slightly different rules, all of whom would respond at different paces. The Heath, I think it was the Gatwick, it might have been Heathrow Terminal 5 actually, I think. The inquiry for that just cost like a really crazy amount of money. Now that's now dwarfed by the Lower Thames Crossing, but at the time it stood out something isn't going right here. And so they reformed the system, and the idea was you have these national policy statements set down in Parliament, and that's meant to provide the clarity for major infrastructure projects and essentially give a democratic mandate for any infrastructure project that complies with a national policy statement. Problem is they've not been updated. So you'll have a situation where, maybe your project, you think it complies with the national policy statement, but someone in the courts can quite plausibly argue and say, well, hang on a minute, since that national policy statement was published, we've had 6 different energy strategies. We've decided that we're going to do net zero by 2050. We're going, which we hadn't before. We've signed up to a new biodiversity charter, so on and so forth. Oh, and the government has cut funding for this and that. Is that really a reflection of Parliament's will? Is that a reflection of what government policy is? And as a result, the answer is no. And you have to come up with both managing all the different possibilities, what a judge could think or a planning inspector could think government policy on roads or railways or wind farms is. And that creates so much uncertainty, so much additional cost. The best way to fix that is to publish. They have to be written correctly. You can publish a bad national policy statement that could just block development altogether. But if you publish up-to-date documents, that will immediately eliminate loads of uncertainty and cut the cost of the planning process. So on the planning side, I think that's really key. Now, in terms of the stop-start, I think having much more certainty in terms of pots of money. I think moving to a system where there's more devolution, so that generally local councils don't flip around in their decision making to the same extent as national governments, and they tend to have a much longer term view, partially because they tend to be within one party's control for a lot longer time. So that probably would create some certainty, but also looking at different ways of funding projects. So part of the issue is that a lot of infrastructure projects are meant to happen tomorrow, but then all of a sudden you realize, oh, your annual transport budget that the government has set is going to be breached. So they do what's called a cost saving exercise, but it doesn't save costs. It just moves the project to a future year, and then moves whatever project would have been done in a future year to an even later year. And what happens? Well, first of all, you have delays, which creates uncertainty in that industrial structure issue. You have to deal with all the inflation, and perhaps it means that you don't get the benefits of that project. Now, if you can do more public-private partnerships, for instance, where you utilize private money and you're not so reliant on the whims of the Treasury, then that's one way of doing it. France, for instance, builds a lot of roads with a large private sector contribution. They use tolls to fund them now. We've done toll finance roads here in Britain. We did them historically as well. Like most of the roads in Britain were toll financed way back when. But this, I think, would be really important. So when we have things like river crossings, bridges and bypasses, actually looking at whether there's a way of bringing in private sector money and making sure that you're not completely, it's not Jeremy Hunt's decision whether or not this project goes ahead this year or next year. It's actually a much more stable source of money. It might push up costs slightly because you have to pay for a return on capital for the private sector, but I'm sure that the added certainty would probably save money in the long run.
Well, on that very, I suppose, IEA note of greater public-private partnerships to, I suppose, fund infrastructure, as well as some other, I suppose, very, very important thoughts about consistency, as well as improving our broader planning system, regulatory state. Thank you so much, Sam Dumitriu, for joining the IEA podcast. That's Sam from Britain Remade, as well as Notes on Growth is his personal Substack for those who want to stay up to date on these issues. If you are enjoying this podcast, please do subscribe to the IEA podcast on your chosen podcast provider, and you can learn more about the IEA's work by visiting iea.org.uk.